My name is Jennifer DeSanto. I'm the Executive Director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at George Mason University. And I'd like to welcome you all to this excellent presentation with our guest, the Honorable Barbara Comstock, a Republican who was elected to Congress in 2014 and served 2 terms representing Virginia's 10th Congressional District. She was the first woman elected to that seat and served as the Chairwoman on the Science, Space, and Technology Subcommittee. She also served in the Virginia General Assembly for 5 years, where she was the Chairwoman of the Science and Technology Committee. Prior to that, she was a senior staffer and Chief Counsel on Capitol Hill, the Director of Public Affairs at the Justice Department, and senior partner at Blank Rome Law Firm. Barbara worked on presidential campaigns in 2000, 2004, 2008, and 2012, and started her own public affairs firm. Barbara was named as one of the top 10 most effective lawmakers in the 115th Congress by the Center for Effective Lawmaking and was a resident fellow at the Harvard Institute of Politics. Barbara now leads the Barbara Comstock Program for Women in Leadership at George Mason's Schar School of Public Policy and serves as a resident fellow at the University of Virginia this semester. She is a senior advisor at Baker Donelson Law Firm and an ABC News contributor. Please welcome Barbara Comstock.
Good afternoon. Great to be with you and great to be with George Mason. As you mentioned, I run the Women's Leadership Program that I had founded actually when I was in the Virginia State House and started it, I believe it was 2012. And I was able to then take it to Congress, and now it's housed at the George Mason Schar School. And so I'm thrilled to have that opportunity. Like everything else this year, we're going to have to be virtual. So we're going to be doing our summer Young Women's Leadership Program shortly this summer, but virtually. So invite folks to be involved in that. But it's great to be part of this George Mason program, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today, I guess, about the 2020 elections. And I think while we are in the midst of this pandemic, while we are dealing with a lot of racial issues that people justifiably want to be able to address and have heard, and there needs to be a lot of listening on that, I think you're going to have a very volatile election year. Not surprising, it's 3.5 years leading up to this. But I think on the presidential front, 2 things are, elections, I think first are always about the future. And then secondly, elections usually are about the incumbent, sort of a referendum on the incumbent. So this is a very different election for the president than it was in 2016, when he was essentially the challenger because Hillary was somewhat seen as an incumbent because her husband had been president, because she had been part of the Obama administration. And she was certainly a much better known figure in that situation. So as you think about elections being about A, the future, B, the incumbent, you have a situation where you have 2 candidates who are 70 somethings, who have been out there for a long time. And I would have to say probably both of them, I think, are focused on the past. So you really haven't heard a lot about the future issues yet. And, who's going to provide that vision of the future? What does it look like? I think that's always an important thing to paint, certainly on the presidential level, understanding what is that future? What are we talking about? When you look back to the 2000 election, George W. Bush talked about, wanting to, he had new ideas on education, on really being able to cross over. He had, as governor, he had strong numbers in the minority community, and he wanted to, expand sort of the party in that vision, but also was really talking about prosperity for a larger part of the population. And then in 2008, you certainly had Obama, talking about a younger generation and also, a new vision for his party. So I think those 2 elections are very different from what we have now, because you really don't have sort of these new characters or new people promoting a new vision here for either party. The president's numbers right now are pretty dire. I'd recommend today, I believe it was in the Washington Examiner, a pollster who I think is pretty good is Kristen Soltis Anderson, who I got to know from my time at Harvard, but also you can see her she's on TV, and she also does writing. And she has pointed out sort of the uniquely bad numbers for the president right now as an incumbent. The range of his his popularity ranges from 36 to 44 with a Real Clear Politics average of 40.4. And he is leading nationally Biden by 9.5%, which is more than he was leading Hillary by. I mean, Hillary was leading at this point by 4.5. So you have Biden leading by 9 points. If you go back to the Obama election in 2008, he was only leading McCain by 7 points and had a blowout election. So this is, an interesting some numbers, but most importantly, as we saw in 2016, the national numbers don't matter so much because, of course, the national polling numbers were not actually off by that much because Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote, but she didn't win those Midwest states. But right now in the swing states, Biden does lead by 6.4% in Florida, 7.5% in Michigan, 7% in Pennsylvania, 6% in Arizona. These are average numbers over a number of polls in the Real Clear Politics average. And then actually 3 points lead in North Carolina and then 6.5 in Wisconsin. Obviously, these are the swing states. These are really the states that will decide the election. I think if you have if Biden were to win Florida, there really isn't a path that the Trump presidential campaign is working on that could win without Florida that I'm aware of. Michigan has been getting more and more difficult. And then you look at a place like Arizona, where the Senate seat was lost in 2018. They have another Senate race up, which was the John McCain seat being replaced by Martha McSally. And so Arizona is a must win for President Trump also. And while he's trailing less there than some of the other states, that's a big problematic issue. And let's see, I think certainly with the pandemic coming back in many of these swing states, also Arizona in particular is having a lot of challenges with coronavirus. And then another thing that I would add here is I think in terms of turnout, you are going to see I think we're going to have a much larger, a considerably larger turnout than 2016 for a lot of the reasons of these issues where people are very much engaged and concerned about a lot of negative partisanship against the president. There was a new youth poll today, I believe, put out by Tisch College, where they talk about youth being much more engaged, considerably engaged than they were in 2016. Now, one of the things I think the Trump folks will tell you, while they have not put out any polls, they say they are comfortable with their internal polls. That is not my understanding. In my opinion, we had some polls that were showing you at least a little ahead or tied, you would put them out at this point. So, but that's what they're claiming. But I think they also do feel that many of the polls that are out there do undercount for some of their supporters, particularly in the rural areas, that there was an understanding. And I think some of the pollsters realized in 2016 that they had maybe overpolled college educated voters, but certainly you are going to see a huge, not only a huge turnout among college educated voters, you have a different dynamic where the president, and I've been on a lot of Republican calls where Republicans will even acknowledge this, there is a huge problem with suburban women in particular. We certainly saw that in 2018, and it's very much a response to the president. And so not aware of any particular strategies that the president's campaign is working on to correct that. I certainly know in the Senate elections, you have many of the candidates very much focused on those issues, agendas to to address those issues. Should note that in 2016, there was not a Senate Republican who won in any state where the president lost. And Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire came the closest to doing that. She only lost by 700 points, while the president, I believe, lost New Hampshire by about 2,100 points. So that was the closest that it came. So particularly for the Senate races, they do tend to track the presidential. Sometimes on the House level, it might be a little easier to survive. I mean, in 2016, I won my race by, I guess it was 6 points, while the president lost my district by about 12. So, but you're not seeing that type of divergence anymore over the past few years since the 2016 election. So I think whether it's on the House level or even on the state legislative level, there is much less crossover voting that we have seen over the past few years. And again, I think that's in large response to the president. So I'd be happy to open it up to questions.
Okay, we have, thank you so much. That was a great introduction to start the conversation off. We do have a question regarding polling. This is from Bruce Jankowitz, and he's asking, we hear of a new poll almost daily, as you noted. Polls are a snapshot in time, historically proven inaccurate. Test a small sample, and my belief is that many may make up their minds in the booth and not reveal their true intentions. What is your opinion about polling accuracy?
Well, I do think, I know like in 2018, certainly Republicans saw inaccurate polling on our side, where the polls did not show us doing as poorly as we had, which the ultimate result was. Whereas in 2016, it was seen as a surprise. But actually, if you go back and look at 2016, and that's what I think a number of pollsters referred to the Kristen Soltis Anderson piece today, the polls weren't as far off as sometimes people say. I mean, I do recall, I certainly knew in 2016 the president was not going to be winning in Virginia, because I could tell that from my own internal polling as well as talking with others in Virginia. So I felt I had a good sense of what the reality was in Virginia. But there was certainly polls that indicated that the president could win Pennsylvania, that he was closer in Michigan than people thought, and that if you had a larger turnout in the rural areas, and sometimes those who are not college educated do get underpolled. That is a concern that's a legitimate, that I think some pollsters have recognized. And I think if you look at, I think it's the 538 polls as well as Real Clear Politics, they often will give a grade to the various pollsters that is based on their track record. So you can see whether it's a poll that has an A because they've had really good tracking over the years and predictions, and then there are some that are B and C. And right now, if you look at the Real Clear Politics or 538, whether you're looking at a Rasmussen poll, which I think is only a C-rated poll, which the Republicans tend to like, certainly the president likes, they are showing the president trailing, as well as the A-rated polls. So this is consistent across the different polls. Now, certainly we know in politics, a few months, 120 something days we have is a lifetime. And with, certainly none of us at the beginning of this year expected that we were going to be dealing with a pandemic. None of us thought that we were going to we thought the economy was going to be, a strong issue, which actually I think for Republicans, that is still going to be an issue that the president's going to focus on. Others, you have seen a remarkable resilience, I think, with the economy, which I think should encourage everybody, and that's to the credit of the private sector. And I work a lot in the tech industry, so I do think the tech community, and certainly I represented a lot of the tech community when I represented Virginia, has really carried us through this pandemic so well. And I think it's pretty exciting to see how well they've done. I think they'll be a big part of the election in terms of, informing people, getting information out there. But I do think right now, all of the polls are pretty consistently bad, but that doesn't mean you can't have a turnaround. George H.W. Bush in 1988 trailed Dukakis at one point by 17 points. But I would point out he had the wonderful Jim Baker as leading his efforts, along with somebody who is certainly, even though he was controversial, Lee Atwater was seen as a pretty talented campaign operator. And I don't think you can say that for the president's team at this point. I think the president in 2016 was. The Trump campaign was fortunate to have, I think, what was probably one of the most incompetent campaigns run by the Clinton operation. They just missed basic things that should have been done, like being in the Midwest states, spending money there. They were running off to Texas when they should have been focused on Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I don't think you're going to see that happen again. I think there's a pretty united front on the Democrat side, but you also have, I think, I couldn't tell you what Joe Biden's message is right now for the future, what his message of his campaign is, besides not being Trump. But since the election is about the incumbent, I think he, as Terry McAuliffe said recently, he should stay in the basement, and that's worked out well for him. And actually, when you're leading and your, opponent is doing himself in some part, you can understand why he does that. But that doesn't mean that's going to hold through November.
So we have an additional So we have a question from Arthur Lerner, just a little bit different from the polling. We do have some other additional polling questions, and we could get back to that. But this question says, after the election, will the Republican Party remain the Trump Party or reinvent itself? If so, will there be a reemergence of a moderate wing?
Well, obviously that depends on what happens in the election. I do think right now you have, and I think actually for the time that we are in, with the unique economic challenges that we've seen, through the pandemic, the changing of our economy to become a online economy, every business is technology now. You've seen Walmart's technology as well as, the technology companies, so that they can get you your goods. So I think we're at a point where both parties are going to be changing considerably, regardless of what happens in November. And I think that's, that first point that I made about needing to be about the future. I don't see either sort of presidential candidate focused in that way now. So depending on, who is elected, then that sort of future orientedness will then be, by those who win, and then want to have a voice on how they see the future economy. I think opportunity for all, and making sure that, because of the, endemic discrimination that we're seeing and that people are talking about, I do think there are many people in both parties who want to take those opportunities to listen and see how they can improve things. I think Tim Scott has done a wonderful job really trying to break through. I mean, unfortunately, because of the partisan times we're living in, some of your people maybe aren't paying attention to what he's saying. Perhaps post-election, regardless of what happens, somebody like a Tim Scott will be able to, bring people together and work on some of these issues. I know right now, Tim Scott and Cory Booker, and I believe it's Ben Sass and Amy Klobuchar are working on some, the next coronavirus package. What can they do on giving people incentives to get back to work? So I think you see people like that and having that ability to work together, that will be the future. And I think a lot of the challenges we face, I know I always felt this when I was in office, aren't so much red versus blue, but they really are about the future and how we approach it. And so I think post-election, we'll have some good conversations on that front.
We have another question related back to polls. And actually, in the news the other day, James Carville came out with a prediction that Trump will probably cut his losses, if possible, to get some waiver on prosecution if he left office before the election. So this question is kind of interesting. Any chance that Trump will drop out if bad polls continue? If Trump loses, how much influence will he continue to have?
Oh boy, I don't really see a dropout situation, but we are in the Trump world is an entirely different world. So I guess I wouldn't put anything past. Maybe that's a little bit wishful thinking by James, but I think certainly depending on what kind of win it is or what kind of loss it is will depend on who has an impact. Certainly, I remember presidential candidates in the past pointing out, once you're out, once you lose, no matter which party it is, you get moved along pretty quickly. So regardless of who that might be, there's always whoever the loser is, then their party will regroup and want to have a new vision. And given both of the candidates are well into their 70s, regardless of what happens, I don't see, that necessarily being the future. I do think you see a resurgence in young people being engaged. I think there will be a new generation of leaders that will start coming up. I was a state legislator. I happen to think state legislators and governors are always a good source of future leadership too. We get too Washington focused here on the presidential basis, and I do think you'll see some leadership coming from those quarters.
We have a question, let's see, from David Adler. What is your feeling concerning increased voting by mail for presidential elections?
Well, largely that's done state by state. I know in Virginia, I recently voted in a primary. I voted by mail. Virginia now has a law allowing everybody can vote, no excuse, vote by mail. I think, you always want to make sure that there is, adequate protections there. But I know there've been a lot of states that are already doing that. And I've always wanted, I think increasing who can vote is important. And I think, young people right now are engaged in making sure more people can vote. If you're a candidate or you're a party, you should always be working on getting as many of your voters out and engaged as possible. So I do know on the Republican side, you do hear a lot of resistance to, they're worried about fraud. You certainly can see fraud in different ways. And I think it's incumbent upon those who are alleging it then to bring forward and demonstrate that and show that. But I do think, particularly this year, because of the virus, you're going to need to have that absentee voting. But it's left to the states, and the states are, I think, stepping up now. Some of them didn't do so well in some of these primaries, and it takes too long to get the results. We don't want to, well, in 2000, we had to wait 5 weeks for results. So I suppose whatever the situation is this year, I don't think we'll have to wait 5 weeks, even with absentee balloting. But I think it's incumbent upon the candidates and the parties and the campaigns that whatever the rules are in your state, you go and work to get your voters out. I know Republicans do have a reluctance they want to vote in person. They don't want to have absentee voting. Sometimes it was difficult to get them to do absentee voting. And I think they need to realize, if you're in a state that has absentee voting, you better be doing everything you can to turn out your voters, and not, if that's the law, you have to work with it.
So we have a question from two members, Bob Heyer and Julia Dorry, and they're kind of related. So I'm going to read Bob's off and then give you a supporting question by Julia. What do you see are the key issues for this elections that each candidate must address strongly? And Julia's is an obvious one. Do you view the lack of national response on coronavirus as affecting the president's position with senior citizens, especially in states like Florida and Arizona?
Yes, I do. I think, certainly the senior citizens have been impacted more than others. And so having a system that's, you have a lot of the governors, I think the governors have really, many of them have done well. I would notably, in our region, I thought Governor Hogan stepped in early and really brought a lot of his expertise with the medical community to bear. Governor Mike DeWine in Ohio also was one who had a lot of, he really worked closely with his medical community. And, certainly, you have mixed bags in each state. I have a son in California who, initially it seemed like they had that under control, and now it's coming back there. So we've never gone through anything like this, so it has been challenging. I certainly was, wanted to have more of a national response from the beginning, but also with a recognition that you had to have each state look at their particular population. And I'll give you an example, like in Fairfax County, where I live, I know it's over half the cases, it may be up to something like 75%, were in nursing homes, either with the patients or the people who worked in nursing homes. And nobody, and I don't think you saw this anywhere in the country, whether on a national or a state level, and it was so obvious from the beginning when you saw the first incident was in a nursing home in Washington State, that we really should have been going in and protecting that vulnerable population in nursing homes, that we should have looked at who are the people who work in nursing homes and what are their situations. And oftentimes you had people who were working at more than one nursing home. So are they going from one place to another? So maybe we should have initially said, if you work in a nursing home, we're going to pay you extra to stay in that nursing home and stay there. Don't go to the second one. Manage that workforce throughout the system. Maybe if going home was threatening, people in their homes, could we have used hotels that had open rooms to help them? But I think a strategy that really localized it to what your population was and who was being infected needed to be done from the outset. I know in Massachusetts, a veterans home that actually a family member of mine was in years ago, they had a huge number of deaths in that. And that was a veterans home where you had just open floors of patients next to each other and everything. And it does not appear, I'm not sure of the details of that, but just knowing what it looked like, I know those are the kind of situations where you needed immediate change there. So I think there's going to be a lot of repercussions for people at all levels on how the response was done. I certainly hope that there will be thoughtful review from the Congressional Coronavirus Committee that's supposed to look at how the money was spent, lessons learned, best practices. And so particularly post-election, I know we're talking about how will this impact the election. I think it will impact. And if you're the incumbent person, whether you're governor or Congress or the president, it's going to have an impact on you. But I hope we'll also post-election really learn from this the way we did, say after 9/11, after TARP, we had a lot of investigations looking at how money was spent there and how to prevent that. So there's going to need to be some bipartisan work on that front. And I hope there will be a recognition of that, and that post-election people will come together so we can prevent this the next time.
So we talked about coronavirus as being a key issue that is kind of overtaken events, and the economy, the fallout in the economy as well will probably be pretty strong topics for the candidates to address. We also talk about domestic and foreign concerns. At this point, we have both going on in ways which we've never experienced before. Can you elaborate on what the Republicans might be focusing on for those key concerns and how they might be approaching that conversation?
Well, I think the economy certainly is is always, I think, a number one issue. Getting people back to work. Now we had, I think the the coronavirus, the various packages, we're up to 3 now. Did provide, you actually, these were big bipartisan efforts. People might forget that now in these partisan times, but the PPP program to help small businesses was something that Marco Rubio worked on. who I think has been very thoughtful in his leadership on this front. And but you had extra money given to people who were found themselves unemployed. That money will be going through the end of July. So for a lot of people, if they've been able to replace there hasn't been that negative impact, which is fortunate. Now, how do we, as we're approaching the end of July, deal with that? And I think that's going to be the discussion we're going to have, next month after the 4th of July break. And I think you're seeing Republicans talk about what can be the incentives to get people back to work. And part of those incentives, I think, include making sure they're economically whole, but they're going into a safe workforce so that you have adequate testing, both the testing for the disease as well as the antibody testing, that we continue to accelerate. And, we have put substantial money has been put in, on a bipartisan basis to finding a vaccine. So I do think this whole discussion, which is more going to be on the state by state level on how we go back to school, is going to be very important. I think this is a real concern, both on the health front, like how do you go back to school, but also if you look at working parents, this is going to be a real challenge for, an economy where we all tried to get more people into the workforce, more people having opportunity. And now if people can't go back to their jobs because their children aren't in school in some type of way that allows them to work, you could set back, I think, particularly working women for years by not having that support there. So what are we going to be able to do about daycare and having kids back in school, and what is the social distancing going to be there? So I know we all want to make sure we do it based on the best health outcomes, but we also don't want our children falling behind on education. Now, fortunately, we've been able to do a lot of things online. My husband's a teacher. He was able to teach online through the end of the school year, but unfortunately, you had school systems like Fairfax County, where my husband used to teach. He's now in a private school, but Fairfax County, I think, failed our children miserably, and some people need to be held accountable there because they are a county that's right in the middle of a huge tech industry, and they managed with all the money they have, and they're one of the best funded school systems in the country, that they failed our children like that is just really unforgivable. I certainly hope over the summer they are improving on that, because I even heard some people who were talking about not going back to school, going to a private school to avoid, particularly if we're not going to be in the classroom. So what kind of hybrid situation we have? I know I've gotten far from what are the issues going to be, but I think these are the everyday kitchen table issues that families are talking about, and how they impact everybody, how they impact disadvantaged families, and what are the opportunities there. It's going to set back those who are most disadvantaged to start with. So that needs to be an issue that is particularly highlighted. And while we are all focused on now with the Black Lives Matter issues, how we can improve, whether it's policing or education in our communities, I think how we deal with all of those, any disadvantaged community, and getting their kids an education and getting them back to school should be an essential issue that both parties are addressing.
Thank you. We do have a question from Denise Van Langen, and pardon me if I mispronounce your name. How concerned are you with election interference by foreign actors in our 2020 national elections? And do you feel Congress, federal departments, and the states have done enough to ensure election security?
Well, I think it's something that needs to be taken and hope, and I think over the past few years has been. You've seen the numerous investigations, Senator, in the Senate, you had both Senator Burr and Mark Warner locally, work on those issues, highlight those. I think a lot of our tech companies are very sensitive to that. And you've seen, during the coronavirus pandemic, they've been taking down all kinds of false information, whether it's on the virus or, incendiary things or now. And I think all of those things that have been going on through the pandemic are also going to apply for any type of election interference. But I think it's incumbent upon elected, every candidate, every, state and local officials and your, all of your election officials to be on the lookout for those things, to understand best practices from the local level on up to the national. I mean, because state, voting is all done, on that local level, making sure your voter roll, it comes down to being like, if you're a precinct captain, I know we'd look at people precinct by precinct and we'd see, well, I remember a precinct captain telling us one time, well, this person doesn't live here anymore. They've moved to Maryland. We know where they live. Why are they on the Virginia voting rolls and why are they showing up? So those are the kind of things, both parties should do. But I think you have had money that has been put into the system over the past 3 years to improve all, and detect any type of foreign interference. But I think we know, cybersecurity is a huge issue that we know. We have, China, Russia, Iran, other bad actors who are going to try and interfere in our election. And I think we should assume they will continue to do that. They will also try and put up false information online. And that's why not only should campaigns be engaged in that, the tech companies are, but also when people look at things and just take it, you can't take anything necessarily at face value just because it's online. You need to look, do your own research and find out, whether something is true or not, because, the platforms provide a voice for everybody, but that doesn't mean that people, can't, every candidate knows there's false information put out about you. Certainly I experienced that as a candidate. I was once, I was accused of being somebody that was sitting behind somebody at an election. The DCCC wrote a whole book saying I was this person sitting behind a witness in a committee that they were attacking me on. And it wasn't me. It happened to be a Democrat Clinton official. And I sent the picture to the I can't remember who it was, whatever news source. And I said, hey, this isn't me. Look at the picture and here's who it is. And I told them who it was. And they kind of were like, well, we're still sticking to our story. So these things happen to everybody. This was before there was any Russia interference. Those kind of things were going on. So I think it's incumbent upon everybody at every level to be very aggressive on that. And I'm sure there will be more money that's going into that. Certainly, Homeland Security has been doing that, the election bodies everywhere, and we provided additional money there. So yes, there's always going to be a motive by those actors. And I think that's part of the increasing and improving our cybersecurity, which here in the Washington, D.C. region, we have the expertise to do that.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Jim Dan. Currently, with very few exceptions, other Republican candidates are staying tied to the president's party line and supporting him. If we fast forward, say, an additional 60 days, and if the polling numbers for him do not improve, do you see many Republican candidates publicly separating themselves from him, or is it practically impossible for them to do that?
Yeah, I guess, I think you're already seeing Republicans have an impact on their polling. And that's why you're seeing a lot of these stories that are out there now with people saying we'd like the president to change his tone. Certainly, for example, I think Republicans have already supported the effort to, take the names of Confederate generals off of our military installations. That makes sense to me. I think that's smart. It's going to be put into the NDAA. Senator Josh Hawley apparently is going to fight that, which I think doesn't make any sense. I think there are so many people, say in the 20th century, who these bases could be named after, and people who, a more diverse group of people. For example, we don't have, maybe some women and some of our minority generals and leaders who we've had in the 20th century. So we have a more fulsome experience for people to know. I mean, we tend to rename things all the time. So while the president is threatening a veto on that, I think you're going to see a strong opposition. I think vetoing the NDAA and raises for our soldiers and things like that would not go well. So hopefully that won't happen, but I think you're going to see Republicans in July first step up on the NDAA and on that front and taking that issue on. How other things may happen. Yeah, I think you're right. You'll probably see some of that in the fall. And given issues change so rapidly, I'm not sure what the issues might be.
Thank you, Barbara. I know we've been throwing questions at you back and forth, and you've been handling it so well. I'd like to give you kind of a softball question just to kind of give you a little breather. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what it's like as a woman serving as a representative, and how you feel about women taking leadership positions?
Well, thank you. That's one of the reasons I started the program at George Mason, was because I think from a very young age we need to have, talk to women and a diverse group of women. I was very proud that my Young Women's Leadership Program it was a very diverse program that really represented our area, because we know that the more diverse a workplace is, we've seen that studies have been done on this. And this was something that when we had our program that we highlighted, the more diverse a workplace is, the actually more profitable it is. So in my party, as you may know, in the House right now, we're down to 13 women. There were 23 when I was there, but that still was less than 10% of what our caucus was then. Democrats now have almost 40% women in the House. And then in the Senate, it's 25% women, but that breaks down 2 to 1, Democrat versus Republican. So I am on several boards of groups to elect women and to find mainstream women who can really speak to a broader audience. And so some of the races that we're focused on this year are Susan Collins and Joni Ernst. Shelley Moore Capito, who was my neighbor in West Virginia, was someone I got to work with a lot. She's been like a great leader on Alzheimer's issues because both of her parents had them. Martha McSally has been a great leader on military issues because she was the first woman fighter pilot. She had to sue her way into that job. So I do think, particularly, for women, I would say when the press would focus on women, it was often focused on Democrat women, and Republican women were somewhat invisible, or we were, treated a little bit second class sometimes. I know when I was in office, I would often point out over my last 2 years that I am the only woman in Virginia or Maryland, so this whole area, who's in the delegation. Like if I would go to a delegation meeting with Virginia and Maryland, I was the only woman there. And that was, the Democrats had all men too. Now that has changed since 18, but it would often be, the press would say, oh, really? Gee, we didn't know that. That kind of like, well, it's obvious, it's right here. Now, Eleanor Holmes Norton has been the representative in DC, but she wasn't a voting member. So oftentimes, we did work together on issues, but oftentimes in Congress, the women would work together on issues. Like when I worked at sexual harassment issue, that was an issue where we worked very much on a bipartisan basis, came together on that because, it hadn't been done for years. And the Me Too sort of Harvey Weinstein moment allowed us that opportunity to step up and do it. But even that challenges from, there was a discomfort level, and I would not, it was bipartisan from the men who didn't like that a lot of these stories were coming out. And it was not that there can't be sexual harassment, female, harassing men. That is a small number. The large number was female. So it was definitely challenging. I certainly think Republicans will not be a majority party until we have more women in our elected offices. I think that starts at the state and the local level. Democrats have more at that level too. That gives them sort of a farm team to then run for Congress, because I think it's easier to run for office. Say if your first office is a smaller area. So I have often encouraged people to run on those state and local races. So that prepares you for really, being able to do the work of government. I was very proud to have been named one of the most effective legislators. And I think it was because I was experienced in passing very valuable legislation, I think, in my state legislature, working on a bipartisan basis, putting together coalitions, understanding you had to have people on both sides usually to support your bill. And then I was able to take that to Congress. And I have to say, even though I had worked in Congress, even though I had been a state legislator, I was surprised by how many members of Congress, whether Democrat or Republican, didn't have those basic skills of how to, you have to get 218 votes or, 50% plus one. And those are some things that I think sometimes women tended to understand a little better, because maybe we had to work a little harder to get where we were. So thank you for the opportunity to address that. ViewPAC and Winning for Women are the two groups I'm on the board of that help Republican elected women. We targeted a lot of primary races, trying to get women to win in the primary, particularly in maybe very red seats, so that they could stay there longer. Because oftentimes Republicans would be like, hey, great, the women can run in those really hard swing seats like I was in, we'll give you those. But when it comes to the red seats, then the guys want to get them. And I think if we are going to have women in Congress long-term in leadership roles, you're going to have them represented not just in the swing districts, but in the red districts, in a diverse group of districts. Certainly, we want to see more. Right now, we only have a couple of suburban women Republicans, and that's tragic.
Thank you, Barbara. And now back to some harder questions.
It's not an easy one, because we have a lot of work to do in that area.
Oh, and absolutely. And thank you for your service in that regard. I think it's wonderful work you're doing. We have a couple of questions regarding oversight of the budget and some specific to the PPP oversight that's being given out due to coronavirus. So let me read two questions. Noah Eggenberg asks, I'm concerned that neither party or major candidate have discussed the need to balance the budget and reduce the national debt. What will it take for the major parties to address this problem? Do you think that a bipartisan solution such as Bowles-Simpson, what are the chances for a bipartisan attempt to finally deal with this problem? And then on a related note, Penny Pickett asks, you mentioned TARP and what was learned through oversight of that spending. The current administration is blocking all efforts for oversight of PPP and the trillions authorized for coronavirus relief. How do we as voters get information on who got the special loans? SBA loans have always been required to be public information, to evaluate effectiveness of the programs and what should be the follow-on relief efforts as the pandemic is surging back?
Well, there has been a special committee that Speaker Pelosi appointed Democrats to, and then the Republicans did put their members on also, which is supposed to look at that. So their job will now be to, ask for those records. I know there has been some challenges, that there have been disagreements on how to get them, but I think ultimately when you're talking about trillions of dollars, you're going to have that oversight. And I hopefully think, that it will be bipartisan, and that you will, we know with TARP, I think it was $11 billion were recovered. I mean, that seems small compared to the trillions we're spending now, but we're recovered, through investigations and identifying fraud. I think you're going to also see some things done on the state attorney generals can do this, because if you have, some of the fraud that's going on with coronavirus is sometimes people trying to take advantage of, say, seniors, or promoting bogus cures, or hitting people online with scams. So state attorney generals can look at that, but every oversight committee in Congress, whether it's the Financial Services Committee or the Government Oversight Committee, which I was chief counsel on at one point, has huge, broad jurisdiction over the entire government. So they can go at that in any way. But then this special committee that was set up, it is designed specifically to go after that. You've already seen things like, when some of oftentimes the way you start these investigations, or a news story might come out saying, hey, why did this big company get a PPP loan when they have all these reserves and they don't need it? Wasn't it designed for smaller businesses or people who had much less, reserves or financial assets? And as a result, just publicizing that, and then members of Congress saying, hey, yeah, why do you guys have that? Why don't you return that money? There's already been money returned because people, I think the companies probably rightfully feel, I don't need a congressional investigation. I don't need the bad press from that. I don't want to have to hire all the lawyers to do that. So Congress, and it's over, that is one of its main oversight roles. When I worked, I was just doing a webinar on this yesterday where we were talking about, I think certainly those who receive that money should be prepared to, identify records, have good records, so that if questions do come up, that they aren't inadvertently, dragged into some kind of situation where there might be some, malfeasance done by other people, say in their particular industry, not by them, but they might get dragged into it. So you want to make sure that, if you're a business, that doing things by the book. But I think it is going to be incumbent upon Congress to do that. Obviously, Congress isn't in session right now, very often. They aren't even there to do their jobs. I mean, I think the Senate's been right to stay open and basically work around this pandemic, wear masks, do the personal hygiene. But I think Congress should be there, because I think if your local grocery stores and your pharmacies and your police and firefighters and your doctors and nurses can go to work every day, I do think Congress, our military that is part of the public service situation. You should be in there doing your job. So if they could probably do more oversight. So, it is incumbent upon them to, be there in person doing this kind of work.
So we've talked about as some key issues as COVID, the economy, education. We talked a little bit about foreign and domestic influence into the elections, and we talked about the budget. But there are a few other things that often come up in elections and are discussed as key topics: immigration, climate change, diplomacy. Can you touch on those?
Well, I think there has always been the numbers for a immigration consensus. And actually in 2018, a number of my colleagues, I think, it was led by Carlos Cabello, who's also a former, but he had a bill that actually the president had said he would support, that had all the elements of what had been past bipartisan efforts. And unfortunately, because of the political climate we were in, you had Democrats who normally would have supported this didn't. And then you had Republicans, even though the president had said he would sign it, felt that they, wanted to, instead of solving this problem, they just wanted to continue to have an issue. So I think unfortunately, both sides of the immigration debate, oftentimes instead of having a solution, people want a campaign issue. Every year's hope springs eternal, and I hope that after the next election, maybe that would change. I think that may depend on, again, what happens and how that's viewed. I think, for example, the visas in the tech community are something that we know when we have people getting those visas coming in here, they are a lot of the people who not only, contribute to our startup community and our tech community, but they employ people, they buy homes, they're part of a real strong economy, and bringing them in here raises our economic well-being. So I have always been an advocate for that. I think some of the, national security issues, unfortunately, what used to be sort of bipartisan consensus on that has broken apart. But although, the president himself has been, more isolationist than I think a lot of Republican leadership is. So where that's going to go, that'll be somewhat interesting, because I think there's sort of an isolationist left and isolationist right, and how each party deals with that, how each presidential candidate deals with that will be interesting, because I think we have I think the military buildup that we've had in areas, say, for example, in areas of cybersecurity, go beyond our military. So they're very important. They protect our infrastructure, they protect our businesses, they protect our banking. So having a strong, cyber is like one of our war fronts that we have to have now. So but we also still have terrorist threats out there that, during the pandemic, we might have all forgotten about those things, but that's still very much out there, whether the bad actors want to harm us through elections or harm us, still in person. That is still very much a threat that we need to be protecting against. So I do still side with my Republican colleagues who want to have a strong and active national security, be engaged in the world, and be part of, NATO, obviously, and in the various alliances that we have that have served us well since World War II. But I think I got away from another question. Someone, I guess, asking about the debt. We've never been very good at dealing with the debt when you have threats, say if it was World War II, or you have a pandemic, or post 9/11 when we had these big threats. So I think right now, when you've seen this trillions of spending, obviously there is that concern. But if we don't get the economy back up and running, and which was doing, very well, the economy being in the good state it was pre-pandemic, was the strongest asset we had for lowering deficits. And I think the advances that we have to, lead the world in technology and medicine and things like that, those are the areas where if we grow and invest, have public-private partnerships there, those are the ways we are going to ultimately bring down our structural deficit. Our deficit also is because, we're an aging population too, if you have fewer people working. So one of the things we're going to have post-pandemic is, how are we working in this new world? And I think we might find some important ways to bring senior citizens back into the workplace, because we need their expertise, whether it's online or other ways. And so we can maybe have a different thinking about work that goes through various generations.
I want to ask you, the scientists have a consensus that climate change is an existential threat to humanity, and this has been also sort of sidelined by the coronavirus, but really also somewhat related to that in populations around the world. What are your thoughts on climate change and the Republicans' view on that?
Well, again, you did have, I was part of a caucus that was bipartisan, and I think you do have ways to come together on those issues. I happen to think that technology is one of the best ways. Certainly we've seen through the pandemic that we can work at home more than we thought we could, right? We've seen increased productivity from working at home in some cases. Now, I know it doesn't work for everybody, and I know particularly for those who have young children, if those young children are home the same time you're trying to work, that is a unique challenge. But I think we will have some lessons learned from this on how we can better, we certainly have lowered emissions over the past 4 to 5 months, whether, even though it's inadvertent, but now we can look at, well, how do we, how can we do more of these things just as a, in the normal course of things when we return to what is going to be the new normal. And I think a lot of people have said, I know I'm a member of the Northern Virginia Technology Council, and they've talked about how when they survey people now, a lot of people are saying they want to have this hybrid of working from home. I'm here in my office today. We have a hybrid right now. We're doing a Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule, and then others do a Tuesday, Thursday. So, how does that work for different industries and different people? And as fewer of us have to go get in our cars and drive to work or take the metro or however we get to work. That is going to lower emissions, as well as finding new solutions on carbon reductions and new energy sources. And that is where I think the public-private investments come in, because I think there certainly is I think post-pandemic, you're also going to have this desire for the US to lead the world in a lot of these areas. And I think climate change and innovative solutions to that, I think particularly in the tech area, I work with tech companies like Google, for example. They've been carbon neutral for years. So when they come in to your area, you're working with a carbon neutral company that's made that a value for their company. And I think a lot of companies are doing that in the same way, that is an important value. And certainly young people are bringing that to the attention of their employers. And so I think it's a good public-private effort that's going on, and the government will continue to find ways that they can advance that.
Thank you. I do want to ask you about the media and your impressions of the media, and as it is the main form of consumption for people who are just everyday people who want to learn about what's happening in their world. They tend to rely heavily on their preferred source of media. Can you give us your thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the things, as you mentioned, I have been an ABC news commentator. And I do want to give kudos to my ABC folks, because they have been the nightly news. ABC has been #1. And I think that's because of their respect for their audience, how they communicate, factual information. And their audience has grown, I think, during the coronavirus, if I'm correct. And I would credit that to people wanting just to have factual information and maybe a little bit tired of this partisanship. Now, that great partisanship and that you see in the cable community, where people sort themselves out as just listening to, one, whether it's MSNBC or Fox. I think that's unfortunate. I would encourage people I like to watch a lot of C-SPAN too. C-SPAN, you're just watching it direct and you're listening to the debate, both sides, and hearing the discussion unfiltered without having anybody, come in. I've always, I was a political science major, but a lot of history. And I like going to historical sites and finding historical information. One of the areas, and I think you've seen this with, in our you have all the battles on our historical sites, but say, for example, at Monticello, at Mount Vernon, they are bringing all these original documents that before had sort of been ignored about all the, what was the enslaved population? What was it like there? And people need to know that information needs to come out more. So I would really encourage people to get back to original source information. I think the news sources that do that do better. I think the way you kind of look at news is who is the person who is giving you the information. So even if you're on, say, like a Fox News, I happen to like, Neil Cavuto, I think is a great business reporter. I think he actually is a pretty neutral guy. He and Chris Wallace get beat up by the president because they're on Fox News, and he doesn't like that they're I guess they're not a Sean Hannity or a Tucker Carlson. I happen to think that's good that Chris Wallace and Neil Cavuto are good sources of just basic information, and it's not partisan. I think you also see that sorted out in other media. But I am a big advocate of social media, because I think it's great that you don't have to have necessarily a network or a cable show or a talk radio show to be able to get your voice out there. And so I still think content is king, whether it's you are ABC #1 news because you have good content, or you are the #1 podcast or blog spot because your content is informative and very valuable. You've seen this during the pandemic where, and I'm going to blank on his name, but he's at the AEI, he's at the American Enterprise Institute, and he used to head up the FDA, and I'm blanking on his name, but he has been a great source of factual information through the pandemic. And so people were following him on Twitter, on Facebook. He's been also appearing on talk shows also, but he, that kind of information has been very helpful. The Johns Hopkins information on coronavirus is what, like that was a great private source of information. So I think we're going through a time where people, are sorting that out. I don't like this, I think you don't want to see government interference in the media. I'm a big First Amendment advocate. The answer for speech you don't like is more speech. And to counter that, Ronald Reagan got rid of the fairness doctrine with bipartisan support, because that was where people used to pretend they were fair if you have one side or the other. He said, listen, let's just get the voices out there, and you can have the competition of voices, and everybody can get their voices heard. When Democrat, now Senator Ron Wyden, and then Congressman Chris Cox wrote what is the Section 230 bill that everyone's debating on whether, on for the internet, that was designed so that platforms wouldn't be sued because you decided you wanted to put up content there, that it would be individual responsibility for the content. I think that is something that we need to preserve, just like the First Amendment. The people who want to get rid of Section 230 or amend it are kind of going back to that fairness doctrine model that Ronald Reagan and Dan Rather actually agreed we should get rid of. So I think in these tumultuous political times, the press has never been so important. Even though, I guess as a Republican, we often, people get frustrated that they don't think our voices are heard as much. But I think having free speech and having the speech that we have and the media we have is far preferable to anything government related or regulated. And you see whether it's Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders on the left or Josh Hawley on the right, these efforts to regulate the media, I think it will be very dangerous, because be careful what you wish for. If Republicans are in charge, you're not going to like how they regulate it. If you're a Democrat, if Democrats are in charge, you aren't going to like how the Democrats regulate and call free speech, because that is always going to be something that's subjective. And that's why the more voices you have, the better.
Thank you. Well, let's shift the conversation to talk about healthcare. Here's a question from Penny Pickett. Is fast tracking eliminating the Affordable Care Act to the Supreme Court now just another wedge issue, a campaign throwaway line about keeping a campaign promise, an assist to Senate candidates, or just a bad decision? Are other candidates now backing away from the well-worn repeal and replace soundbite in the midst of a pandemic?
Yeah, I think, I was surprised that did go forward. I guess, what was it, 20 states, and then the administration joined. Certainly when I was in Congress, that attempt to repeal and replace, I ultimately, even though I did support that, the longer it went on, and when Republicans came up with a bill, as famously that John McCain didn't support, I actually hadn't supported the House version either, because I didn't think it lived up to the billing of what we said we were going to do. For example, we always said we were going to allow you to control your own healthcare and be able to take deductions by you individually buying it on an open market across state lines. I still think that was a good idea. That was not included in our package. And there were, I think now, because it's been in place for as long as it has to carefully be reformed and or replaced in a way that you give people the confidence that they are getting a better healthcare system. You can't, because healthcare is life and death. So, by the time we were trying to do it in 2017, it had already been in place for some time. So doing it in a very careful way, I thought was important. And since then, Republicans have not come up, but, and obviously in the House, the Democrats took charge of the House, so there really wasn't that opportunity. But there still are obviously many flaws with it that, people continue to find, on cost and all. But I think particularly in a pandemic, we have to be very careful in providing that. And I think one of the areas where, again, there was a lot of bipartisan support was in the public health area, realizing that there were always going to be public health threats, that you had to have a robust public health system. And I think the pandemic has only reinforced that no matter what healthcare system you have in place, there are going to be people who fall through the cracks for whatever reason. And having a robust public healthcare system is going to be more important than ever. And we've seen that with the need for testing, with the need for tracing, with the need to make sure that our hospitals and our public health system have the the technology to be able to identify quickly something before it spreads.
Thank you. At the beginning of the conversation, you spoke about the vision of the Republican Party, and that perhaps Trump's vision isn't exactly what the traditional vision of the Republican Party has been. Can you help to kind of define that a little bit? What is the Republican Party's vision for vision, period, and Trump's vision? This is a hard question because it's curious we're just curious to know how those two things align, because Trump is such a celebrity personality individual, kind of a unique, independent individual. And we're asking you about the Republican Party as a whole. Can you give us some answer to that?
Well, I think sort of the populism that the president has represented, brought to the fore in 16 and throughout his term, is something that's not just going on in the Republican Party. You see it with Bernie Sanders on the left. You also see it throughout Europe. So I don't think it's something necessarily unique to the United States or even to the Republican Party, because whether it's Boris Johnson in Great Britain or some of the nationalist things that are going on throughout Europe, this has sort of been a reaction to those who I think feel left behind in what is a new economy and a changing economy. And you've had this happen before in our history. So I think there needs to be an understanding, and I think that's sort of the conversation that unfortunately it's pretty polarized, but I think when you sort of dissect it, there are those who feel left behind, say maybe in the rural, or people who aren't college educated, who feel they're looked down upon and not part of the elite or the new economy, the new world. And how do we bring and then you also feel there's also that dynamic that is a racial dynamic where people who feel they've been left behind, that they have not been able to be promoted and get the same opportunities. So how do we bring all of those people together? And I think, I was in a district that was very integrated, and I think we are becoming more and more an integrated country. And I think that's a good thing. And the more, instead of living in different worlds, the more we are more cross-pollinating and living in those integrated communities, the more we are going to have some better conversations there. So in an optimistic way, I guess I'll look forward past this election year. You're going to have redistricting. And I think what you're going to find is that there's going to be more purple territory, technically, than just solid red and solid blue. And as more people, now, if you're in New York City, it's going to still be blue. But look, who is the most unpopular mayor in all of the country? It's de Blasio. I mean, Republicans and Governor Cuomo agree that this mayor is a disaster. So what's going to be? So that's not that's not partisan. They all think he's awful and he's doing a terrible job of running the city, right? So you're going to have some real changes, even in an area that's really blue. And I think how those changes are made, as well as more, say, congressional districts and even more states become more purple, because people have, like in Arizona, a bunch of California folks have moved into Arizona. It's made it a little bit more purple, but then the people often leaving California are leaving it because it's too high tax and they want more opportunity, and they feel like there's more opportunity over in Arizona. So what happens when they come over, and what are the discussions that go on there? Texas is becoming more purple. So what happens, when a really red state becomes more purple? What are the discussions that go on there? I think that I look at that from a positive standpoint because when I was elected, I was a Republican, I think center right, who represented territory that was, except for my predecessor, usually won by Democrats. So I enjoyed having those discussions sort of across party lines. I mean, because when you're talking, say, about jobs and education, it really isn't partisan. It's like you can't waste a single student there in these classrooms. And so these kids who are falling behind, that's tragic for all of us. So I know in my district, if you went and looked at a kindergarten, it was usually majority minority. And that was not only, this is oftentimes, I think, what both Democrats and Republicans don't understand is that that's the case in communities, not just poor communities, but in affluent communities. And so it's very integrated racially, economically, and that's what you want. And I think our kids understand that better than, say, the people who are in office right now, because our kids have grown up in in diverse schools, and they've had more diversity in their lives than we did growing up. And I see that positively with my grandkids already and with my kids. And I think that's the future that we're going to have. And I think both parties are going to have different discussions about that. And I think that may be good for both parties. Does that make sense?
That's good. That makes good sense. I think probably that would relate back to the work that you're doing with the women and getting people engaged with becoming representatives.
As you mentioned, that program is nonpartisan. So even though we do some government things, it's always, it's more like, how do you have a career? How do you get involved in this? And I've helped place kids who wanted to go work for a Democrat senator as well as a Republican. So, but it's also in all kinds of other leadership and other type of careers. And so it's been nice on a nonpartisan basis to see advancing a diverse group of women and realize whenever I work with young people or college kids, I am very optimistic about our future, because I know a lot of people look at what's going on now. They see the unrest and they see the turbulence and they see what's probably going to be a very nasty 120 something days. But I tell them, look past that, because our country always does rise to the occasion. We do better. We help people all around the world. There are exciting, I think through this pandemic, you've seen charities, kids in high school who are raising money for charities to make sure they're helping everyone in their community, and all kinds of just really wonderful, blessed things going on out there. And that's the future that I see and I'm optimistic about, that is sort of post this election here, post pandemic, and
it's nice to have some optimism. That's a good note. There are two questions here about DC statehood. I'm going to read these for you, but I think the final question I'd like to end on, after you've had a chance to discuss DC statehood, is your prediction for the VP selection for the Democratic Party. So think on that while I read you these two questions.
Okay.
Arthur Lerner's asking, if you were voting in the House, how would you have voted on the DC statehood initiative? And Doris Chivis, I'm sorry, Doris, I can never say your last name. Dorsey. What are the chances for DC statehood? So similar question.
Okay, well, when I was in the House, I had not support. Actually, I don't know if we ever had a vote on it. So, but I had not supported that, because we thought DC was always supposed to be unique. I think because just of the nature of an amendment getting through 2/3 of the Senate, given the dynamic there, I don't see that passing. So I think maybe in terms of issues and how people want to maybe do things to improve things in DC, that there probably are both short-term and long-term things that might be more productive on that front. On the VP front, I think I think the Atlanta mayor, I think, has been one of the most interesting of the most mentioned people. And I think she might be a stronger pick than, say, Kamala Harris, who's, just coming from California, which, Biden's going to win anyway. Georgia's a swing state. She has both experience with the police as well as the city. I've found her, I'm still a Republican, but I think she might be an interesting pick. But I don't make any, I guess if I were predicting what would be the conventional wisdom, I guess Kamala Harris would be the conventional wisdom. I don't think VP picks never have that much, everybody angst over it, but it never has that much of an impact ultimately. And as I started out, I said, I think, elections are about the future and they're about the incumbent. So I don't know that it'll make that much of a difference who Joe Biden picks. Even though people say, well, but he's old and, who he picks may be really more important than the average. I still think elections are about the incumbent. So I don't know that it'll make that much of a difference.
Okay, well, we'll wish him the best of health as we move forward. I'll give you the last word. We have a couple minutes left. If you'd like to kind of wrap up your thoughts to share with us. And we want to thank you so very much for your participation today. This has been an excellent and educational lecture. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I always appreciate the opportunity to be with the George Mason community. Again, I'd love to highlight our women's programs, particularly our Young Women's Leadership Program for the summer that we will hopefully be able to do in a few weeks here. We'll be doing some online programming through the rest of the summer. So it is designed for junior high and high school young women to engage with women leaders in a variety of professions. And so usually we would be taking them to the workplace because it's one of those, if you can see it, you can be it type things. But fortunately, through the new world that we're all used to and getting online, we'll be able to communicate a little bit in that way. I do want to leave everybody on an optimistic note that even though you are probably going to go through what I think is probably going to be one of the ugliest presidential elections in our lifetime over the next 120 days, I do feel like when you look at what is going on in our communities, particularly in our innovation community, in the tech world where I love to work, in our medical fields where we are going to have a vaccine by, I guess, at least next year, if not by the fall, because of the brilliant young people and the community that we have working on these things, and because of the support that the government has given all of them. And I think we have some exciting things going on for the future. So I do think young people should be engaged in the process, be involved, get your parents, your grandparents, your friends engaged and involved, have difficult discussions, challenge them, allow your views to be challenged. One thing, particularly for the young people, I would encourage them, because in this polarized world that we live in, if you don't have friends who think differently than you do on some really big, important issues, then you don't have enough friends. And expand your pool of friends and find people that you can genuinely like, who actually think differently than you do on some really big, important issues that you like, and learn from them and learn. And I think the more you have friends like that, because you learn from people who, even though you may not ever agree with them on an issue, understanding their experience, understanding how they approach issues, and then knowing that you really like them and respect them, even though you think differently than they do on issues. And I'll give one example. I worked on Supreme Court nominations and know a lot of the Supreme, so I worked for Republican nominees because I'm a Republican. But I have such great respect for people like John Roberts, who I worked on his confirmation hearing, Sam Alito, Justice Kennedy, who's now retired, who is my neighbor, Justice Scalia, who also was a neighbor of mine, and then many other people I've worked with. Those people I've just named have come down on different issues in different ways, most recently too. I still continue to have great respect and admiration for those people, as well as for public officials who work and think differently than I do on things. And I have learned a lot from knowing and liking people who think differently than you do. I think, Justice Scalia had a wonderful friendship and admiration for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I think that's probably your best example maybe of a friendship of people who truly respected each other. And they would often exchange opinions that they were going to write, and they'd each criticize each other's opinion to make it better. So if it was going to be a Justice Ginsburg opinion, Justice Scalia would actually make it better by poking holes in it, and vice versa. And isn't that wonderful? And if we could all kind of, in our public lives and in our policy lives, really respect people instead of a lot of the name calling that goes on now, then I think you could actually, we'd have better public policy and better outcomes too. So, and sort of, I think, I hope in the things that I was able to do, that's why, I was able to get legislation passed and had that privilege to work with people who had those diversities of views.
Thank you so much for your thoughts and your time today. We really appreciate your involvement at OLLI. Thank you again. And thank you all of you who wrote in questions. We weren't able to get to all of your questions today, but we do appreciate that you participated in on the call. This program was brought to you by the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University.